Let's start the third and final session today. And let's have a look at what we'll be covering in this session. We'll begin with a Vipassana meditation, looking for the meditator, me, the meditator. See, is there a meditator to be found here anywhere? And then a few tips for that practice after the meditation. And then we'll follow that with a review of some of the earlier points. And then we'll be looking at how we make boundaries out of the world we create, and thereby we are stuck in this extreme of existence. And then how to find that middle way between the extremes of existence and non-existence. We'll then look at the nature of mind and do a meditation regarding nature of mind. Question answer, and we'll finish with dedication. And so we'll start with this meditation, looking for me, the meditator. And we'll use a sort of a classic approach to this meditation. So if you'd like to find a nice, comfortable posture, let's begin. We prepare the body by establishing a good posture, back straight, and allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. Allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. And allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. Resting in that stillness. And then from that stillness, start to become aware of the sensations of the breath throughout the body. Now, do you have a sense that there is a me here who is meditating? a me who's trying to relax the body, and a me who's trying to focus the mind on the breath. A me that seems to exist from its own side and doesn't seem to depend upon anything else to exist. Do you have this experience of being me, the meditator? Can the me who's meditating here be found anywhere? Can the me who's meditating be found anywhere within the body? So look thoroughly in every part of the body and look for the me who's meditating. Is the meditator somewhere inside the head? Somewhere behind the eyes? Is the brain, is that the me who's meditating here? Or is the brain simply something which me, the meditator, is using? Is the whole body itself? Is that the me who's meditating here? Or is the body simply something which me, the meditator, is trying to relax? Can, can me, the meditator, be found anywhere within the mind? So again, investigate thoroughly and check every part of the mind and look for the me who's meditating. Are any of the thoughts, emotions, or concepts in the mind, are any of those the me who's meditating? Or are thoughts, emotions, and concepts simply things which me, the meditator, has? is the whole mind itself. Is that the me who's meditating here? Or is the mind simply something which me, the meditator, is using to focus on the breath? Or is the me who's meditating simply the collection of the body and the mind? Or is the collection of the body and the mind simply two things which me, the meditator, is trying to train? Yet, other than the body and the mind, what else is there here? If there's nothing more than the body and the mind here, then where is me, the meditator, who possesses this body and mind and is training this body and mind? If you can't find me, the meditator, simply rest in the experience of not finding. And even if you didn't find me, the meditator, isn't there someone who's experiencing all of this? So there is a me sitting here trying to meditate. But how can the meditator exist if we don't seem to be able to find it? Me, the meditator, exists as something merely labeled on the body that is sitting here and the mind that is focusing on the breath. The merely labeled me is sitting here meditating. We can bring the meditation to a close. So just some tips for that practice, and some of these points we covered in the earlier session. So some common experiences for this emptiness practice. The first one is not being able to investigate well, being confused, not being able to search very clearly and so forth. And so this is an indication that we need to improve our attention skills, to cultivate more mindfulness, to be able to have a more calm, clear and focused mind through the shamatha practice. And then you'll find it's much easier to clearly investigate and to search thoroughly. Another common experience, as I mentioned in the earlier session, often we turn this into an intellectual exercise, that when a question is asked, where is the me? Then often the intellectual mind will go, oh, no, don't need to look, I know the answer. And the intellectual mind will simply answer on the basis of whatever belief system we have. And so examples of belief systems, if we've had a Christian background, we may say, well, the real me is the soul, because that's what goes to heaven or hell. If we've studied a little bit of Buddhism and heard that it's a subtle mental continuum that goes from life to life, then we'll say, well, I'm just a subtle mental continuum. Or if we've studied some more New Age philosophies where often it's said that everything in the known universe is subtle energy, subtle vibration, then we'll simply go, oh, I'm just subtle energy, I'm subtle vibration. But then we're not doing the practice. And so we need to leave out our whatever beliefs we have. They may or may not be accurate, may or may not be correct. We are wanting to find the answer empirically through direct experience. And then another common experience, I think I already mentioned earlier as well, is that when we're doing the search, fear arises, existential fear. And generally that's a good sign that we're doing the investigation well, and we're coming to see we can't find the me, but then we're misinterpreting that not finding as there's no me at all. And we're falling into this extreme of nihilism. So remember, not finding doesn't mean no me. It means no findable me, no independently existent me. And so if you're falling into this existential fear, two things you can do. One is you can ask, who's having the fear? Because if you don't exist, there can be no fear. So the fact that fear arises confirms you exist. The other thing we can do is study a little bit more of emptiness to understand that not finding doesn't mean no me. It means actually dependent me. And then instead of fear arising, if we don't find, we'll have a lot of joy arising. So just to review a little bit, so we're talking here about the cognitive balance, and from a Buddhist perspective, that is gained through this Vipassana practice, applying mindfulness to gain insights into reality. To apply mindfulness to gain these four insights of impermanence, suffering, no self, and emptiness. And so we're looking now at emptiness, and we saw here that in the Perfection of Wisdom teachings, the Buddha said that if we investigate, we'll come to realize nothing exists independently because everything exists dependently. And so that's what we mean by emptiness. Emptiness means everything is empty of independent existence, or in other words, empty of inherent existence. Why? Because they're dependent arisings. And we saw there that things come into existence dependently in three ways. They come into existence depending on causes and conditions, parts, and labeling. And we saw here labeling is not simply there's a thing there that we're calling it a certain way. Labeling is the whole process of creating objects by drawing lines around various collections of data and creating meaningful objects and then giving a name so we can communicate. And how we do that is not fixed. It's completely arbitrary on the meaning that we want to get out of what we experience. And so therefore we saw that two terms, things are merely labeled, meaning things only exist within our conceptual framework, that they're not findable there in the basis. The example here of the star. There's no star to be found there in the basis. The only star that exists is the one we've created in our conceptual framework by creating a single object and giving it the name star. And so but we have to do this. We have to draw lines, create objects, and give them names to make sense or meaning. Otherwise, we couldn't function. But the problem is, when we look out on the world already seems like it's divided up into many separate, discrete things. And so we simply accept that. And so what we've done by seeing the world in that way, or believing that the world is already divided up into many separate, discrete things, we've turned the lines that we've drawn into hard boundaries. We see the world made up of many separate things. Why is this a problem? Here we see the problem, is that ignorance here is this grasping to independent existence, and seed is the habit of doing that. We've had the habit of believing such a world since we were born and well before. When we look out on the world, everything appears to exist completely independent of us. So there seems to be what's called subject-object duality. But this view of emptiness is saying the way in which things appear is deceiving us. So actually, this is what's called mistaken dualistic appearance. Everything appears to exist independent, but that's not how they exist. But everything we've ever seen has always appeared to us in this way. So there's no reason to question these appearances, so we never do. And since we have the habit of grasping and believing these appearances, we never question. So we go to step 2, which is ignorance, which we're now actively grasping onto these appearances, believing, yes, there is a world existing there, independently made up of many separate, discrete things. There's an independent subjective me here. We've turned the line into a boundary. Now, whenever we experience things, we always have this mental factor of feeling, which in Buddhist perspective is not, it doesn't mean emotion. It's simply experiencing things as either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So let's say we're looking out at some flowers. They appear to exist completely independent of us. We never question that. We just accept that. Yes, there's some flowers existing there independently. That's step 2. But let's say when we experience those flowers, we have a pleasant experience. That pleasant experience, together with the belief that those flowers exist there objectively, will naturally lead me to assume there must be some attractive quality there that's causing my pleasant feeling. So we'll see those flowers as inherently attractive from their own side. And from a perspective of emptiness, this is a misconception. Or if we see flowers and we have an unpleasant experience, we'll naturally assume there must be some unattractive quality there causing my unpleasant experience. We'll see them as inherently unattractive. Or if we're having a neutral experience, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, inherently neutral. So once we get to step 3, having this misconception, step 4 easily follows. So let's say again, we're looking at the flowers, they're having a pleasant experience. I like pleasant experiences. I want pleasant experiences. Those flowers seem to be causing my pleasant experience. I want those flowers, attachment. Or if I'm having an unpleasant experience when I see those flowers, I don't like unpleasant experiences. I don't want them. Those flowers seem to be causing my unpleasant experience. Get them out of here, aversion. Or if we're having a neutral experience, that will simply reinforce our mistaken belief that those flowers exist there objectively independent of us, and that is ignorance. But here at step 4, we often see the word confusion. Confusion is the same as the word ignorance. Confusion doesn't mean here confused about whether or not they're flowers. We're confused about how they exist. We believe they exist independent of us. These three mental afflictions are called the three poisons. They are the three main mental afflictions. All other mental afflictions come out of one of those or a combination of them. These are what's driving our behavior, our actions, and every action we do based on a mental affliction from a Buddhist perspective has a result, has a consequence. And the consequences of our actions are our experiences. And our experiences collectively, we saw earlier, described using the word dukkha or suffering. So this is how this turning lines into boundaries, believing that there is an objective independent world already out there, leads to misconceptions, leads to mental afflictions, and leads to our suffering. Now, in most of our experiences, the very first line we draw is we draw a line around here and we create the experiencer, because there's single experience. And within single experience, there are two aspects. There's experiencer and experienced. And we need to distinguish the two to make sense or meaning, to function. And I think a newborn baby can't even really do that. So we correctly draw a line, create experiencer, experienced, good. We have to function. But then the problem is we don't realize that's what we're doing. What we do is we contract around the experiencer, turn the line into a boundary, and split ourselves off from the experience and see ourselves as somehow independent of what we experience. And so we're what's called self-grasping, grasping onto an independent me. But then we are completely out of sync with the interdependent nature of reality. And so we are fighting against reality. And when we fight against reality by having attachment to pleasant things, aversion to unpleasant things, then we have mental afflictions and suffering. And so in this Vipassana practice of emptiness, it's very much recommended we start here. Look for the me that seems to be here, this independent me. Is there an independent me here? And if we come to realize there's no independent me here, then by default, we'll realize that then there's, of course, no independent objective world out there. But this self-grasping is completely illogical. And we use the example here. We see the pen up the top here in the diagram. And I can ask the question, is this big? Is it big? It can only be big compared to something which is smaller than it. So big can only exist relative to small. Like that, up can only exist relative to down, and in to out. Similarly, me can only exist relative to not me, you, the world. But when we grasp onto an independent me, that's exactly like saying this pen is big. It just doesn't make any sense. And we tend to grasp very strongly onto this me, this independent me. And we have it often very strong in our behavior, because we often have the me perspective in our actions. Me doing this, me saying that, me going there. It's always me, grasping strongly. And the stronger we grasp, the more out of sync we are with reality, the more likely of mental afflictions and suffering to arise. But sometimes in our actions, this self-grasping is not as strong. And that can come when we're more focused on the activity rather than the agent doing the activity. For example, when we're absorbed in reading a good book, absorbed in watching an interesting program on TV, absorbed in solving a problem at work. On those occasions, we're more focused on the activity. So self-grasping is less. And what we notice on those occasions is things seem to flow quite well. Time seems to go quite quickly. Why? Because we're more in sync with the interdependent nature of reality. And this is very much magnified or exemplified in people who've really developed a high level of focus in their activities. For example, people like professional musicians, professional athletes who've spent thousands of hours of training in their activity and have developed a high level of focus in their activity. So much so that when they engage in their activity, they often report that they're in the zone or in the flow state. even to the point where they say, well, there was no real sense of me. There was just the music playing, just the sporting activity happening. Not only that, but in those occasions, they report peak performance, optimum performance. Why? Because they're much more in sync with the interdependent nature of reality, because due to their focus, the self-grasping is very much reduced. But here in Vipassana practice, we're not only talking about reducing self-grasping through focus. We're talking about eliminating self-grasping by realizing there is no boundary. There's not one single boundary in this entire universe. And particularly now, that will lead us to be able to easily cultivate boundless love and compassion for everyone. Now that's difficult because there seems to be a me here and a them there. Seems to be like a separation. And so then if there's suffering, someone else has suffering, well, okay, that's their problem, not my problem really. If they're a friend, maybe I'll help them. If not, not really. But if we realize there's no boundary, then when suffering arises, whether it's in this body or that body, same response. The automatic response is compassion. And so this is actually a measure of how, if our emptiness practice is going in the right direction. If we're meditating on emptiness and having some sorts of experiences, then what we should start to notice in daily life is that we should start to notice not only our mind starts to be more calm and less mental afflictions, but we will start to have more loving kindness and compassion to others. This is a sign that our emptiness practice is actually going well. But as we saw earlier, we tend to be stuck in these two extremes. There seems to be only two possibilities. Either there is a real subjective me here and a real objective world out there, or there's no me and no world, because we've never seen any other me or world than the one that seems to exist independently. So when we investigate me or the world and come to see we can't find it, then we misinterpret that, meaning, well, then there can be no me and no world. And we fall into this extreme of non-existence, because now we're in the extreme of existence, grasping onto everything existing independently. And the antidote to that is investigating and to come to an insight into emptiness, to overcome the extreme of existence. If we notice we're falling into the extreme of non-existence, wrongly thinking that emptiness means nothing really exists and falling to nihilism, then the antidote to that is dependent arising, to reflect on the fact we do exist. We exist through causes and conditions, parts, labeling, likewise the world. And so what we are doing here is finding the middle way between these two extremes, stripping away all what we lay on top of reality, that, in terms of the hyperactivity we saw earlier in terms of cognitive balance, that we're superimposing independent existence on reality. We need to strip that away without stripping away reality itself. It's a little bit like we want to throw out the bathwater without throwing out the baby. If we strip away the reality itself, we end up with nothing, we end up with nihilism. And so this is how to find that middle way, is understanding emptiness and dependent arising. And here we have a quote from Nagarjuna, a great Indian master from the 2nd century, on about the middle way. He says, that which arises dependently and related is explained as being empty. And that which is empty is dependently designated. This is the middle way path. And so again, the measure of understanding of emptiness, the measure of finding the middle way, is that first we are stuck in the two extremes. And we think that, well, if things are empty, then they can't function. And if they function, then they can't be empty. But if we deepen our understanding of emptiness and dependent arising, then we'll go to the next state and we'll go, well, actually, despite the fact that things are empty, they can function. But the real measure of correct understanding is that because things are empty, they can function. And because things function, they must be empty. Again, if this cup existed from its own side as being a cup, if it had a unique nature of being a cup from its own side, it couldn't change. You couldn't create it, you couldn't destroy it, couldn't function. But because it has no unique nature from its own side of being a cup, then it can change, we can create it, we can destroy it, it can function. And so therefore, emptiness and dependent arising are like two sides of a coin. This is the middle way between the two extremes of existence and non-existence. Another quote from Nagarjuna here, he says, whoever invalidates the emptiness of dependent arising invalidates all the conventions of the world. This is the measure of a correct view of emptiness and of finding that middle way between the two extremes of existence and non-existence. But if we can't find the person, and there is a person, then how does that person exist? And so we can say, using the pen example, we start there, it's a little bit easier. So we saw there earlier that the pen is not the collection of the parts. The pen is merely labeled depending on the collection of the parts. So similarly, the person is not the collection of the body and the mind. The person is merely labeled depending on the collection of the body and the mind. That's the me that exists, the dependent me, often called the mere I. Mere I means the I, the me, the person that is merely labeled, that does not exist more than that exists depending on cause and conditions, parts, and exists depending on labeling. But then you can ask, who or what goes through life and goes on to the next life? And to answer this question, the question itself is a bit misleading, because what goes seems to ask, what is the thing that is moving through time? But if we just simply begin by looking at the physical world, is there anything in the physical world moving through time? Superficially, it seems like this cup is moving through time. But actually, if we look closely down to the atomic and subatomic level, there's no static cup moving through time. There's just a flow of change. And in that flow of change, we have to make sense of the meaning of that. And so what we do is we create that cup in our conceptual framework to make sense of that flow of change. Similarly, the mind. Our mind seems to be a thing moving through time. But if we look closely at our mind, it's just a continual flow of mental experience, constantly changing the mental continuum. So therefore, at the physical world level, at the mental level, there is no thing, static thing, that actually moves through time, that goes through time. There's just a flow of change. And so with regard to person, then in the present moment, the me that exists is a me that's labeled on the body that is present now and the mind that is present now. And at every moment in our life, the me that exists is that me labeled on that flow of change called the body and the flow of change called the mind. So we can see that not only the basis of me, but me itself is not a static thing moving through time. So there's no me going through time. But what we can say, if we don't understand, is the me is that moves through time is the mere I, the me that is simply labeled at every point on the basis of the body and the mind that is present at that time. And similarly, we can talk about going from life to life, is that there's a continuity of body and mind as we move forward. The body changes a lot, the mind changes a lot, but at every point, we can talk about the mere I, the dependent me, the me that is merely labeled on the basis of the body and the mind. That's the me that moves through this life and goes from life to life. This me is the dependent me. It's not a static me that is moving through time. And so we begin the emptiness practice with person. Generally, it's often recommended start with me, the person, because that's where we start to go wrong, grasping onto independent me. But also then we can investigate the mind. And in some traditions, particularly in the Mahamudra Dzogchen traditions, when they come to this emptiness practice, that's where they really focus. Is there a mind to be found here somewhere? And so what we mean by mind is, definition of mind is that which is clear and knowing, or has clarity and awareness. Sometimes that's how it's translated. And so these two words, the first word, clear or clarity, is entity, is describing the entity. And the word clear or clarity implies two things with respect to mind. Because the mind is clear, has clarity, means it's not physical. So it's not the brain, it's not a property of the brain, it's not emergent property of the brain or function of the brain. It's non-physical. But also the word clear or clarity implies the mind is clear, has clarity, means that therefore things can appear in it. Just for example, like a mirror is clear, therefore reflections can appear in the mirror. Because the mind is clear or has clarity, therefore thoughts, emotions, images, and so forth can appear in the mind. The second word is the function. What does the mind do? It knows, it is aware. The mind engages in those appearances. So that is a very simple definition of mind. Mind is that which is clear and knowing. Origin, where does the mind come from? Like everything, it comes through causes and conditions, what's called substantial cause and cooperative conditions. So just like the substantial cause of the plant was the seed transformed into the plant, and the cooperative conditions were all the things like soil, sunlight, water that helped that transformation to take place. So what is the substantial cause of the mind we have now? Is the mind of a moment ago. The cooperative conditions are all the various other physical and mental processes going on that contributed to that transformation into the present moment. And also, one of the fundamental principles of classical physics is the conservation of mass energy. You can't create mass energy, you can't destroy it. You can simply transform it. So similarly, in Buddhism, we have a similar theory of conservation of consciousness, that you can't create consciousness, you can't destroy it, you can simply transform it. And so therefore, just like in the physical world, conservation of mass energy, if we go back to the beginning of the universe, where did the matter and energy at the first moment of this universe come from? Well, we talk about the Big Bang, but that doesn't mean that suddenly the universe comes from nothing. That would violate fundamental principles. So even though we can talk about a beginning of this universe in terms of the Big Bang, that's not the beginning of mass energy. It's beginningless and endless. We can only transform. Similarly, the mind, we can talk about the beginning of this life, but the beginning of mind itself, we can't, we'd have to say that mind comes from nothing at the beginning of this life. So therefore, there's a previous moment of mind. So it's beginningless and endless. This is one of the consequences of conservation of consciousness, causes and conditions. And then we can talk about levels of mind. The level that's active now is called the coarse mind, or in psychology, it's often called the psyche. And within this, we have a lot of levels. We have conscious and subconscious or unconscious. So we have a threshold above which we are aware of what's going on in the mind. Below that, we're not so aware of it. In shamatha practice, as we cultivate mindfulness, that threshold will drop down, which means we'll start to become aware of more and more subtle levels of mind, activity of mind that we're not aware of now. But when we actually achieve shamatha, we drop down actually to the next level of mind called the subtle level of mind, sometimes called substrate consciousness. This is the ground state of the coarse mind. This is the level of mind from which all of our mental activity emerge and dissolve back into. And this is what we gain access to through shamatha training or shamatha practice, or attentional balance. And this is what we use in Theravada and Mahayana Buddhist traditions, then in Vipassana practice to move along the path to nirvana and enlightenment. But we can also talk about a deeper level of mind called the very subtle level of mind, sometimes called primordial consciousness. And this is what we gain access to in Vajrayana or Tantra level of practice. This is also sometimes called the mind of clear light, pristine awareness, Rigpa. It's given many different names. This is really the ground state of consciousness in general. And this level of mind is atemporal and non-local. Atemporal means beyond time. Meaning that literally time and space emerge from this level of mind. And therefore it's non-local, meaning it's not individuated. So we can't really talk about my very subtle mind and your very subtle mind, because all of time and space and everything emerges from this. And this is what we access in Tantra or Vajrayana practice. And we use this in Vipassana, gaining an insight into emptiness and move along the path to enlightenment. Very difficult to gain access to. Then we can talk about nature of mind. What is the nature of mind? The conventional nature of mind is simply the fact that the mind is clear and knowing. It has clarity and awareness. That's all. And we come to realize this conventional nature of the mind through shamatha practice. Simply by looking at the mind, we see this clarity of mind. We see the function of mind, it's knowing, it's aware. We realize this in shamatha practice, conventional nature. The ultimate nature of the mind is how the mind exists. And in the Mahayana traditions, then the ultimate nature of the mind is emptiness. We come to realize the mind, like the person, like everything else in the world, is empty of inherent existence, does not exist from its own side. In Vajrayana, when we talk about nature of the mind, we are coming to realize the very subtle level of mind, this pristine awareness, which is already indivisible from emptiness. So it's worded a little bit differently, but emptiness is within both of those levels of nature of mind. And so that's what we're going to do now. We're going to do a meditation looking for the mind. And we'll use instructions here from great Indian master Padmasambhava from the 8th century. And just as we did in the previous meditation, we looked for the meditator. Now we're going to look for the mind or consciousness of the meditator. And he says, steadily observe the consciousness of the meditator and search for it. What sort of shape does it have? Likewise, let yourself check whether it has any color, size, or dimension. So we're going to search for this mind and see if we can find it, using a number of different questions, to come to realize that the mind also is not findable, does not exist from its own side. It's empty of inherent existence. That's the practice we're going to do now. Find a nice, comfortable posture. Let's begin. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. And relaxing more deeply with each out breath. And with each out breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. Releasing all activities of the mind. And simply allow the mind to come to rest. To come to rest in the present moment. Not doing anything at all. Simply being present. Knowing that you're aware. Resting in awareness itself. The awareness that you are resting in, where is it located? Is awareness inside the body? Look closely. Is this awareness inside your head? Is awareness located somewhere outside the body? Does awareness have a particular shape or color? Look closely. Does awareness have a particular size? Is it very small? Is it very large? Does awareness have a center? Does awareness have a physical limit, an edge, a boundary? Is there anything that is outside of awareness? Is awareness located in physical space? Or is physical space located within awareness? And then release all investigation and just rest. Rest in awareness. We can bring the meditation to a close. We have lots of time for questions, so either again put your questions in the chat or you can ask them directly. Any questions in the chat yet, Nitzan?
We have one question.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't seeing emptiness lead to indifference or detachment?
Wrongly interpreting emptiness, as we saw that we're stuck in the two extremes. If we realize emptiness, then if we have an insight into emptiness, but we wrongly interpret that, we could slide into nihilism, and then nothing probably matters, doesn't care. So, I've heard, and it's not easy to find this middle way. I sometimes hear Buddhists talking, supposedly who've studied and meditated for some years, and I still hear people saying things like, oh, it doesn't matter because everything's empty. This is completely the wrong understanding of emptiness. This is nihilistic view. This is a misunderstanding of emptiness. The correct understanding of emptiness is because things are empty, everything matters. So the flip side of emptiness is dependent arising, or in terms of other people, the flip side of emptiness is compassion, loving kindness, compassion. So therefore, if we are falling into indifference or apathy, I would suggest that we are not doing the Vipassana practice of emptiness correctly. And so therefore, it's important to get more instructions from a qualified teacher so that when we go into Vipassana practice, we can do it correctly and come to our correct insight. And then what we will find is the outflow of that is that actually we'll be much more concerned for our own welfare, but certainly we'll be much more concerned for others' welfare. We'll be spontaneously having more love and compassion for others. And again, so the answer is because things are empty, everything matters. Any other questions? So just a little bit more on that. So again, emptiness means functioning world. Functioning world means emptiness. So this is, and in that functioning world, again, there are a lot of people who are suffering. And so if we realize emptiness, then you will find that your love and compassion for others will certainly increase. It would become very difficult to be indifferent. If we really have some deep insights into emptiness, that wouldn't happen.
Okay, thanks. there is a question here that again they want to return discussing the next life, the next rebirth. If the,
Sure.
if nothing exists by its own side, including our how do you say, spiritual advances, then if we continue, how can we how do you say, influence our next life by our actions now?
Because there's continuity. So we see that in the physical world, there's continuity. There's a flow of continuity, causes and conditions. Everything is causes and conditions. And so through those causes and conditions, then things change and propagate. And so similarly in the mind, we have causes and conditions. And so if we want, and that will continue. And so if we want to have a good future life, then we need to create the causes and conditions now. Just like if we want something in the future in this life to unfold in a good way, we need to create the causes and conditions, because there is causality both at the physical level, the mental level, and experiential level. And you could say that, for example, we are reborn in every moment. So you could say, in a sort of very sort of poetic way, that we are literally reborn in every moment. But that doesn't mean when we're reborn in the next moment, what we did in the previous moment doesn't care anymore because there's a new me now, so then I've lost everything. No. In fact, that reborn is causes and conditions. And so we're just extrapolating that out from the sort of constant being reborn in every moment to being reborn in many lives. So it's the same principle is applying, whether we're talking moment by moment rebirth or we're talking rebirth over lives. There is a continuity there that continues on. And so, and because that mental continuum is continuous, the body, the physical body support changes a lot. Although at the subtle level, the subtle energetic level, then that also continues through from this life to the next. But at the coarse level, this coarse body, of course, finishes and we get a new coarse body. But at a more subtle level, there is definitely that continuity of the support of the body and also the mind as well. There's a continuity, and that continuity is through causality. So everything we do in this life will flow through to the next life. Any more questions?
Yeah. What do you mean when you say awareness? Is it another word for mind, or is it a mental factor?
Yeah, a very good question. This word, unfortunately, this word awareness is heavily used in Buddhism, and unfortunately, different translators translate different Sanskrit terms with the same English word awareness. And so it can get very, very confusing. When I was using it here, resting in awareness, I was using it synonymous with mind. Just rest in your mind, rest in consciousness, rest in awareness, same. But we saw even in the definition of mind, briefly in that slide, the mind is clear and knowing is the definition of mind. But often that knowing is translated as awareness. So sometimes it's translated the mind has clarity and awareness. And so their awareness is used as a verb in terms of functionality, the function of the mind, to be aware. But as a noun, the word awareness, when we're speaking very generally, mind, consciousness, awareness can be interchangeable. In some traditions, particularly in Tibetan Buddhism, such as in the Dzogchen and Mahamudra systems of practice, the word awareness generally is used very specifically, not in a very general way as we have done here. And often in Mahamudra and Dzogchen, when they use the word awareness, it's synonymous with the very subtle mind. We looked at those three levels of mind briefly: coarse, subtle, very subtle. And that very subtle level of mind in the Geluk school is called the clear light mind, or mind of clear light. And in Dzogchen, sometimes called Rigpa. And Rigpa is a Tibetan word which literally means awareness. And so often when in those traditions, when they talk about awareness, they're often really talking about the very subtle level of mind. So the answer to the question is about the word awareness is we have to try to understand the context in which the person is using the word to try to understand what that person means by the word awareness. But again, when we speak generally, as I was doing in this session, then resting in awareness is the same as saying resting in the mind, is the same as saying resting in consciousness. That's how I was using the word awareness. Any further questions? We've still got plenty of time. Just to add a little bit more then, in this Vipassana practice of emptiness, when the view of emptiness is described in the meditation texts, they'll usually use or often use a physical object to establish the view of emptiness. For example, in Chandrakirti's classic emptiness text, he uses a chart or a chariot, a cart or chariot to establish the view of emptiness by pulling apart the cart and the chariot and say, well, is this a chariot? Is this a chariot? Pull all the bits apart and say, where's the chariot? Put them all together to come to realize there's no cart or chariot to be found objectively, that it's only existing within the conceptual framework. So that's a little bit easier to understand emptiness dependent arising, to use a physical object to intellectually appreciate what emptiness and dependent arising mean. But then when it comes to Vipassana practice, meditation, then often it's the classic approach is to first start with me, the person. Where is the me that seems to be here? Because this is where we start to go wrong. When we've drawn the line and created the me, the experiencer, then we grasp onto that me as existing completely independent of the experienced. So if we look for that me to come to see there's no independent me, then we can more easily realize the emptiness of other phenomena. So that's where it's often recommended to start. In the Mahamudra Dzogchen traditions, particularly because they're trying to gain access to the very subtle level of mind, then when they go into Vipassana practice, they won't really spend much time on looking for the meditator or the person. Rather, they go straight to the mind. Where is this mind that seems to be here? And that's the meditation a little bit, one of the meditations, the meditation we just did now on looking for the mind, looking for awareness, looking for consciousness. Any further questions? I think maybe there's another question come in the chat now.
Yeah. Could you please elaborate on the Rigpa and the relationship to subtle mind?
With what, sorry?
The relationship with the subtle mind.
The settled mind.
Subtle.
Subtle mind. Oh, subtle mind. Okay. Rigpa is actually a Tibetan word, and Rigpa is what we translate into English as awareness. And within the context of Dzogchen, when they use the word Rigpa, they're really, pretty well most of the time, they're really talking about this very subtle mind, the mind of clear light. The mind that we have now, that's active now, is called the coarse mind. Lots of agitation, dullness, distraction, mental afflictions, and so forth. So not very workable mind. And so what we're doing in shamatha practice, the attentional balance training, is we are subduing this coarse mind. We are making it more subtle, therefore making it more calm, more clear, more focused. And so when we are, so that threshold that we have between conscious and subconscious, now we're only aware of very superficial mental activity. A lot of mental activity that's actually going on now we're not aware of because our mind is not very clear and focused. In shamatha training, that threshold between conscious and subconscious goes down a lot. And we'll start to become aware more aware of more subtle mental activity going on in our mind. But when we actually achieve shamatha, we'll drop through those coarse levels of mind and we drop down to the next level, the subtle level of mind. And that subtle level of mind, as I said, is the ground state of the coarse mind, meaning that all of that mental activity in the coarse mind is arising from the subtle mind and dissolving back into it. So we have our own coarse mind, we have our own subtle mind. That subtle mind is much more calm, more clear, more focused. That's what we gain access to through shamatha practice. So if we can gain access to that subtle mind, then that is the optimal level of mind to use in Vipassana practice, because then we can really apply mindfulness well, and we can much more easily penetrate the nature of reality to come to an insight into nature of reality, a direct insight into nature of reality, and thereby overcome all mental afflictions and suffering. And so what we find is in the Theravada Buddhist traditions, in the Mahayana Buddhist traditions, then they talk about shamatha practice, or in Theravada they call that jhana practice, where we're gaining access to that subtle mind. And then in Vipassana, or in the Vipassana in Pali, in the Theravada, we use that subtle mind to gain insight into impermanence, into suffering, no self and emptiness. And thereby we can slowly move along the spiritual path to liberation from suffering, to nirvana, and then to enlightenment, if we're following the Mahayana path. But then we said that there is an even deeper level of mind called the very subtle mind, called mind of clear light, Rigpa, primordial mind, given many different names, pristine awareness. This is extremely difficult to gain access to. But in Tantra or Vajrayana practice, there are practices that help us to gain access to that very subtle mind. And if we can gain access to that very subtle mind, it's much more powerful than the subtle mind, which means that if we use that very subtle mind to realize emptiness, we can accelerate the spiritual path to enlightenment. That's what we're trying to do in Tantra or Vajrayana practice, and in systems of practice such as Mahamudra and Dzogchen. We're trying to gain access to this very subtle mind and then use that to move more quickly along with a realization of emptiness, more quickly along the path to enlightenment. So this Rigpa, or very subtle mind, is a much deeper level of mind than simply the subtle level of mind. But very difficult to gain access to. But if we can, then we can accelerate the path to enlightenment. We've still got some time left if there's any questions more.
Yes. Do you have to practice first through shamatha, or to access the subtle mind differently?
The subtle mind is accessed through shamatha practice. In Theravada traditions, it's called jhana practice, but it's the same practice. It's a concentration practice, and that's how we gain access to that subtle mind. We can talk about, I mentioned in the coarse mind, the mind we have now, that's a whole bandwidth within coarse mind. And so we have conscious and subconscious. And so we're trying to gain access to more subtle levels. Initially, in shamatha practice, we're gaining access to more subtle levels of mind within the coarse mind bandwidth. But actual subtle mind, as it's defined in Buddhism, we only get there once we actually achieve shamatha. And it's that level of mind that we will need to gain a direct insight into emptiness. If we're still in the coarse mind, even if we've refined the coarse mind with some shamatha practice and our mind is more clear and focused, very good, and we use that, we can get some insights in Vipassana practice, but we won't be able to get a direct insight into emptiness. To gain a direct insight into emptiness, we need a very stable, clear, focused mind. We need the mind of shamatha. Anything less than that, we can gain some insights into emptiness, but not a direct insight, not a direct realization, which means that that insight will have some impact in our life for a while, but it'll sort of slowly wear off. Whereas if we gain a direct insight into emptiness, then that's a stable, long-lasting effect in our life. Any more questions?
How can we achieve it through Tantra or Mahamudra?
How can we achieve what? Through
I think,
Tantra or Mahamudra?
Access to the subtle mind, I think.
Tantra or Mahamudra, well, depends what you mean by Mahamudra, because you can talk about Sutra Mahamudra and Tantra Mahamudra. Sutra Mahamudra is simply the normal shamatha vipassana practice that we've been looking at here in attentional and cognitive balance. So, but often when we use the word Mahamudra, we're talking about the highest level of Mahamudra practice, which is gaining access to the very subtle mind, and similarly with Tantra. So the basis of Tantra and that higher level of Mahamudra is the sutra level of practice, is shamatha vipassana. So what we find in those systems of practice, whether we're talking about Tantra, whether we're talking about Mahamudra or Dzogchen, if you look at them, what they say, where do you start? In fact, you start with the preliminary practices, as we saw in the first module here, that we need to start, we need to start with the preliminary practices to have a foundation. Then we need to engage in shamatha practice, the attentional balance training. Then we need to engage in vipassana practice, what we'll be looking at today. Then when we have some deep experience within shamatha and vipassana, then we can go into Tantra or go into the high level of Mahamudra or Dzogchen practice, because then we have the basis. So all of these practices that we're doing in this program here in terms of preliminaries, shamatha, vipassana, compassion, they are the foundation for Tantra and for Dzogchen Mahamudra practice. If there's no more questions, we'll leave it there. Any more questions? Last questions before we wrap up today? Okay, then let's leave it there. And let's finish today by dedicating all of our efforts that we've gathered through doing these 3 sessions today. And we can dedicate them using, again, the Shanti Deva dedication prayer. So again, while I read out the dedication prayer, you might like to reflect on the words. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Thank you. And so next module, 2 weeks' time, we'll be looking at emotional balance. And within Buddhism, that's translating into compassion practice. So we'll be looking at the 4 immeasurables. We'll also be looking at exchanging self with others, in particular, looking at the Tonglen practice. And in the last session, we'll be looking at really how we can have an integrated approach covering all of these 4 areas of mental balance in terms of the motivational, attentional, cognitive, and emotional balance, to really how we can put them all together to have an effective method in striving for mental balance and well-being, and how to really integrate these elements into daily life as well. So we'll be looking at that in the last session in the 2 weeks' time, when we look at emotional balance. So that's it for now. So see you back here in 2 weeks' time to complete this program, look at emotional balance. Until then, stay safe, stay well. See you in 2 weeks' time.